The United States is today amplifying its military presence in the Caribbean and off the northern coast of South America, dispatching a formidable naval force to the region. The deployment centers on the USS Gerald R. Ford CVN 78 aircraft carrier strike group. According to official U.S. Navy statements, the ship and its escorts entered the area of responsibility of the U.S. Southern Command on November 2025. The Pentagon says the deployment will bolster U.S. capacity to detect, monitor and disrupt illicit actors and activities that compromise the safety and prosperity of the United States homeland and our security in the Western Hemisphere. At the same time, Venezuela has mobilized in response. Nicolás Maduro and the Venezuelan government are preparing what they describe as massive military mobilization amid warnings of possible U.S. intervention. To help unpack what is happening and what the actual goals may be, I spoke with Dr. Jennifer Parker of the National Security College at A&U. She began by emphasizing the scale of what is underway. It absolutely is. And look, not to downplay the drug smuggling that occurs in the Caribbean, but deploying an aircraft carrier on top of the 8 warships, including amphibious craft and a nuclear-powered submarine, is not about counter-narcotics operation. Dr. Parker noted that the U.S. buildup has been underway since September, featuring not only naval assets, but the deployment of B-1 and B-52 bombers. This is about a demonstration of capability, she said, and I would agree this is about coercing the Maduro regime to step down. What she is highlighting is a key shift in narrative. While the U.S. officially frames the deployment as a counter-drug trafficking and transnational criminal organization mission, many analysts see it as signaling a broader strategic posture aimed at Venezuela's government. When pressed on what the U.S. realistically hopes to accomplish and whether there is any substance to reports of boots on the ground in Venezuela, Dr. Parker responded, "There has been a lot of reports about this. Certainly, we saw President Donald Trump acknowledge that he had endorsed CIA operations in Venezuela. Around the same time, President Trump also said that he wouldn't hesitate to undertake land strikes against narcotic smugglers in Venezuela." She went on to point out that while maritime drug trafficking is real, the bulk of fentanyl entering the U.S. comes from Mexico by land, and the major flows of cocaine originate in Colombia. In other words, the deployment mismatches the mission as stated. She concluded, I think it is very much about pressuring and also about responding to the relationships that Venezuela has with Russia and China, and the view from the U.S. that this is occurring in their backyard. On the matter of Venezuela's friends, namely Russia and China, stepping in to support Caracas, Dr. Parker was cautious. I think that is probably unlikely. Russia is very much tied down in their illegal invasion of Ukraine and probably doesn't have a lot of capacity beyond that. And China has a lot of things it needs to focus on, both internally but also in the South China Sea and Northeast Asia. So I think that is unlikely, she added, but I think the U.S. would be concerned about China and Russia influence in what they see as their backyard. That aligns with recent reporting. In May 2025, Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Maduro signed a strategic partnership agreement centered on energy, arms control and diplomatic cooperation. That agreement entered into force via ratification in the Russian parliament. And yet Moscow, while supporting Venezuela politically, has publicly indicated that it does not intend to provide military defense commitments. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Caracas has not requested weapons or troops under the treaty. Meanwhile, Venezuelan appeals for military assistance to Russia, China and Iran have been reported, including requests for radars, drones, missile systems and other hardware. Given that backdrop, the U.S. military deployment takes on multiple layers beyond maritime interdiction. On paper, it is about combating narcotics, trafficking and transnational criminal organizations. In practice, the hardware, a supercarrier, destroyers, amphibious ships, submarines, F-35 aircraft, Reaper drones speaks to far higher-end capability. For example, the USS Gerald R. Ford's arrival means the largest U.S. military presence in the region in decades, possibly the largest since the invasion of Panama in 1989. In a region where Coast Guard and small patrol craft were formerly the norm, this is a dramatic uptick. When asked whether this will genuinely put the cartels on notice, Dr. Parker had a nuanced take. Maybe, but I don't think it is going to effectively diminish the capacity of drug cartels in South America. You would honestly have to take out their land facilities and their land networks. This is not a problem you can solve in the maritime domain and on the water. So I don't think this is going to really have a significant impact in the long term. I think this is much more about the Maduro regime and that relationship than it is about narcotics smuggling. So while a clear message is being sent, the map of actual impact is less certain. Here are the key contextual facts that update the conversation. President Donald Trump is again in office, and his administration has ordered the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group to the Southern Command region. The U.S. military buildup includes not only naval assets, but aircraft, drones, and amphibious capabilities, signaling a shift from mere interdiction to potential land airstrike capability. Venezuela and Russia ratified their strategic partnership agreement in May 2025. Russia has publicly stated it will not provide a defense guarantee under that agreement. Venezuela has responded by mobilizing forces and warning of resistance in the event of U.S. intervention. The U.S. campaign already has executed striking operations in the Caribbean and Pacific, targeting vessels allegedly used for drug trafficking. Some legal analysts view these as on shaky legal ground, given questions over jurisdiction and sovereignty. The official justification remains narcotics interdiction and dismantling transnational criminal organizations, but the resources applied appear to align more with broader strategic objectives focused on Venezuela's regime and its global alignments. Going deeper, the U.S. Navy's press release emphasized that the carrier strike group's mission is to support the president's directive to dismantle transnational criminal organizations and counter narco-terrorism in defense of the homeland. But the deployment scale and the timing point to a twin objective, applying pressure on the Maduro government and underscoring U.S. military capacity in its Western Hemisphere. From the Venezuelan perspective, President Maduro has repeatedly framed the U.S. presence as a direct threat to his government and sovereignty. He alleges that the deployment is aimed at regime change, a view which many regional governments and analysts are taking seriously. The Venezuelan government has even issued warnings of guerrilla-style resistance and is reportedly mobilizing what it refers to as militia units. The U.S. is also watching closely Caracas's connections to Moscow and Beijing, while Russia's resources are stretched due to its war in Ukraine, and China is focused on the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. sees the Venezuela-Russia and Venezuela-China ties as emblematic of adversary influence in its backyard. In this regard, the carrier deployment is also a signal to both China and Russia. Dr. Parker said the U.S. would be concerned about China and Russia influence in what they see as their backyard. There is also growing debate about the legal basis for U.S. strikes on maritime vessels and what happens if operations move to land. Experts question whether drug trafficking boats on the high seas fall under legitimate self-defense for the U.S. and whether striking land-based targets in another sovereign state crosses into state-on-state conflict. The original transcript flagged this when Dr. Parker said many strikes that a lot of international lawyers would say are illegal. Looking ahead, it remains to be seen how the standoff will evolve. While the likelihood of large-scale boots on the ground intervention into Venezuelan territory appears low, both because of the global signaling it sends and the diplomatic risk involved, the U.S. retains a range of options from increased naval and air patrols and strikes against vessels to possible targeted air or missile strikes on land if it chooses to escalate. The transcript included the line, "I think at this stage it's unlikely that the US are going to want to put boots on the ground because of the signal that sends across the world, including in the messaging to China in the POTA, Indo-Pacific, about how the US views international law." As for regional neighbours and drug trafficking organisations, the message may be loud, but the impact uncertain. The deployment may disrupt some maritime routes, but the broader networks of smuggling, land transport and domestic cartels are deep and resilient. In short, what appears to be a counter-narcotics mission is also a heavy geopolitical lever. The projection of US military force into the Caribbean and off Venezuela is not merely about boats and drugs. It is about regime pressure, strategic influence and signalling to global powers. The next phase is what happens if Caracas does not back down, how Moscow or Beijing respond, and whether the US moves beyond seas into air or land-based operations will determine whether this is a credible deterrent or a dangerous escalation. Dr. Parker's concluding note was sobering. This is much more about the Maduro regime and that relationship than it is about narcotics smuggling. That assessment may prove prescient as the region watches carefully what comes next.